Hi, welcome back and welcome to our next module. Our next module is on nucleic acid structure and chromosome structure and DNA replication. So is what we're going to talk about here to start with are just some basic properties of the genetic material just to get us oriented to what we're talking about. Okay, so the first thing is that the genetic material, DNA in the organisms we're most familiar with, but in some viruses, the genetic material is actually RNA. But let's stick to what we know best: bacteria and plants, fungi, animals, protozoa, that kind of thing. Genetic material there is DNA, and so that molecule is all about information. One of its main functions is to contain information. And that's the information required to construct an entire organism. Now, yes, for sure, it's certainly true that the environment will play a role in the phenotype of the organism, but the basics of the construction and development of an organism are coded for in the genetic material. So that makes probably its main function the storage of information. So whenever we start talking about DNA metabolism, when we talk about genetics at all, we're always talking about the flow or the transformation of information. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind when we're talking about genetic material is that it has to be accurately copied, and we call that replication. So if we're going to pass the genetic material on to our offspring, or from cell to cell within a generation, we need to be able to replicate the DNA accurately. So when we look at its structure, we'll be able to draw a relationship between the structure of the molecule and the function of the molecule, which is to be replicated. I mean, no one says a function of the molecule per se, but you certainly have to replicate the DNA to pass it on to offspring. So that kind of gives us our next major important feature about genetic material, and that is that it must be transmissible. And that means two things. First of all, it has to be transmitted from parent to offspring. So when you pass your genes on to your offspring, if you have children, is what you're doing is you're passing on the genetic material. Now you only pass on half your genetic material, half the genes come from you, half from your partner. So that's one level of transmission. So we've got to have some characteristics of the genetic material, which means that it can be transmitted. And we'll talk about that in more detail when we talk about mitosis and meiosis. We also think about transmission within a generation. So every time one of your cells divides, which is what you're seeing on the screen here, every time a cell divides, the genetic material must be replicated. And when the cell divides, that is the transmission of DNA, of the genetic material, from one cell into two cells. So that is between cell generations, if you like, from cell to cell. And so that's important. We've got to accurately replicate the DNA so that we can accurately transmit the DNA to either cellular offspring or to the next generation, if you like. When we're thinking about the genetic material, we must also evoke some characteristics which allow us to explain variation. So variation, this again means two things. We've got to think about variation in the individuals we see within a species. So if we look at two individuals, two humans, classic, easy example, two humans, we see a significant amount of variation. What characteristics of the genetic material allow us to explain that variation? Then we can go to another level of variation and think about differences or variations between species. So what characteristics of DNA means that we can have variation between the species? And how do we accumulate that variation? And how is that variation spread through populations? And that's getting into the realm of population genetics, which you'll talk about in another semester. We can also talk about similarity or identity as well, because although you are different from your parents, you are obviously related to them, and you carry half your mother's genes and half your father's genes. So you look similar, you have similar behaviors, and so we have to evoke some characteristics of the DNA which help us explain the similarities as well as the variation. So I'm going to wrap it up here. There's a real short overview of just some of the main important points about the nature of the genetic material, and we're talking about DNA here. And so keep those things in mind, and they're going to keep coming back, and we're going to explore them from the perspective of the relationship between structure and function. So I'll wrap up there, and I will see you again shortly.